talking about trauma-sensitive educational settings. This is specifically looking at Chapter 6 of the Cross and Tower text. So let me just give you a brief overview of what this PowerPoint is going to be about. So this PowerPoint is going to talk about adverse childhood experiences. It's going to talk about different educational settings and just kind of talk about how does a school and how do these educational settings, how do they start the process of being able to take care of a child that's having trauma or receiving trauma or has gone through trauma. And so we're really going to be breaking down kind of those institutionalized understandings of what a school is, what we can provide to assist students when they're at school, and then things that schools should really be aiming to start implementing in the classroom so that we can benefit students. So, trauma and academic failure. An educational setting is a place where learning is the primary goal of a child's participation. As we go through this PowerPoint today, you're going to learn about a bunch of different types of schools. There's different child care centers, all the way up to even colleges and universities. Anytime you're entering an environment in which you're going to learn, you need to feel safe. That's a very primary goal as an educator, because if someone is not feeling safe in the environment, they're not going to be able to learn. And so trauma-sensitive educational settings recognize that trauma is a risk factor for academic failure. And then they use this knowledge to limit the negative effects of trauma on the children. It's also important to know that childhood trauma does not discriminate. So obviously, different schools have different populations of people who have different issues. However, an issue is still an issue. Trauma is still trauma. Just because it might be a different type of trauma doesn't mean that it's not happening at a wealthier school versus a school that's struggling economically. Almost all traumatized children will show some sort of observable effects. Now, we've talked a lot about these observable effects through just reading the Bruce Perry text so far. I've mentioned a lot of this in the different lectures, but this can be behavioral outbursts. This can be social isolation. This can be like chronic absences and not wanting to go to school. This can be fighting. This can come through violence. Any type of sort of irregular behavior pattern can definitely be linked to some type of traumatization that's happened with a child. I wanted to kind of break down this lecture today with a couple different diagrams. Now, I thought this one was really interesting. The title of this diagram is Percentage of Children with 2 or More ACEs. Again, the acronym ACE stands for Adverse Child Experience. So this is like a child that's experienced some type of trauma. And again, this is 2 or more ACEs. So kind of just scan the different regions. The percentages that are highlighted are the ones that are significantly higher and just kind of interesting to look at. You will notice that the highest population all across America that is essentially receiving these adverse childhood experiences typically is the Black population in the entirety of the United States, and then in those specific regions. Some other higher statistics, the other is just the variety of other races, like all kind of combined together. We see that higher in the mountain in the West, North, Central. And then again, significantly higher numbers when you look at like the Black community in the mountains versus and alongside the West, South, Central. So just really interesting to know because I think a lot of times people can really kind of create some prejudice in their brain for certain areas in America, certain types of places, and creating and linking that to trauma when this visual really shows you that it's widespread. And there are some populations that just experience a little bit less of this, but pretty generalized, this is occurring all over America to many different types of people. I also want to take a look at how trauma affects how our brain processes things. I wanted to break down some of these things for you just as we start to enter looking at how should an educator be talking to a child? How should we be teaching? How should we be creating these environments with this as our understanding? So, number one, the brain is regularly scanning for real or perceived threats. Our information is filtered through the limbic system, where we instinctively decide if we're going to fight, flight, or freeze. So the limbic system here is just essentially this part, like anything that's labeled here on the brain is what we call the limbic system. Then number 2, when a threat is perceived, the amygdala alerts the hypothalamus to release stress hormones and alarms the sympathetic nervous system to fight, flight, or freeze. So these are all working together here, now deciding, okay, based on the situation, how am I going to react? Now, again, like, especially if you are a child that has occurred, like if trauma has occurred in your life, you're constantly looking for threats, and someone talking to you in a certain way or looking at you in a certain way could really trigger essentially a connection to a past traumatic event. And now you're in the classroom when everyone else is focused on learning, and you're focusing on, are you going to fight this adult? Are you going to try to run from the scene? Are you going to freeze and shut down? And again, as a teacher, I've seen all 3 of these. Number 3, reaction to fight, flight, or freeze. So fear, frustration, heartache influence the mind, resulting in unrelated decisions, choices, and reactions. This can be the very hardest thing. As an adult working with a child that's experienced trauma, it can be really, really hard not to take their actions and their choices personally. I've worked with many students before that resort to just really mean name calling and degrading phrasing towards the adults that they're working with. And you have to understand that that's not necessarily really how they feel. And again, they're a child that's gone through a traumatic event. And also to think about too, typically when children are, specifically if they're picking fight in this brain scan choice that they're making, whether it's between fight, flight, or freeze, if they pick fight, then there's a part of them that knows that you're comfortable enough with them that you're going to be able to see them through that. I've talked to many different school psychologists before, and oftentimes the students with the most severe trauma react the most severely towards the adults in their life that they love and that they feel the most secure with. So in the past, I've been that kind of bad cop routine, like I'm going to give you the routine that you need and you're not going to react positively to that, but the structure is going to help you in the long run. And sometimes that kind of can cause a flare up of behavior, just because, again, you're their safe person. And then finally, 4, prior childhood and adult trauma increases the brain body response. So this idea that the more trauma you have, and with prior trauma, the parasympathetic nervous system is automatically activated. So essentially, like, even though maybe someone who hasn't experienced trauma, if someone says something to you the wrong way, like, you can kind of sit there and think through it a little bit. But again, like, if you've already had a negative experience with this in the past, your brain is essentially just going to click right into deciding to disassociate, to become numb. Which part of this 3, fight, flight, or freeze, are you going to personally choose? And so just thinking about how, like, trauma really affects our brain chemistry. And a lot of times a child will behave a way that they don't really mean to, nor do they really want to behave that way towards you. The idea of regulating your emotions becomes extremely difficult for a child that's experienced trauma and is perceiving potential threat in a classroom, in a store, in a shop, in a club, all these different ways that we might interact. So with that being said, I just wanted to kind of jump now into taking care of children. So childcare in America is absolutely ridiculously expensive. It can cost families over $16,000 a year, and this is very similar to the cost of some affordable college education. Success in childcare involves education, support programming, and resiliency building for parents. High quality care comes with high quality expenses, and this can be many varieties. So this could be a specific childcare center, childcare home, at-home care, before and after school programs, vacation, and summer camps. Many people choose to not work after they've had a child, just because their salary potentially might not cover the cost of things like childcare. This is something that in America, it seems will just continue to become more expensive as people become more weary of unaccredited institutions. Like, of course, you don't want to send your child somewhere where it potentially could be a bad situation. But then again, think about the equity in this of if you know that you're not going to be able to financially afford it, but you have to go back to work. And so you sacrifice and send your child to a place that maybe you're not comfortable with. And then a negative thing occurs, like that traumatic cycle could potentially continue. So it's a very interesting thought here. Obviously, we need to start working towards a more equitable system in America, where childcare should be free. Childcare should be provided. I have been in many different school districts. This is the first district I've ever worked at where they have what's like a building blocks academy, where you can send a child birth to 4 years old, and then they have a transitional kindergarten program. And then, of course, also as being a teacher, then if I were to have a child, I wouldn't have to pay. Versus my husband this year has recently picked up a position at a private school in which the tuition can cost up to $40,000 a year for a child. And our schools are not very far away from each other. And so one community, multiple options here. And again, it really shows you how unequitable our current system of childcare really is. So let's talk about some different types of schools. In America, children are required to attend school from ages 6 to 16. There are many states in America where preschool and even kindergarten are not mandatory grade levels that are attended. And that's why it says from 6 to 16. The typical age that a child will start school is 5. And most schools, for a child to be allowed to start, not only do they have to be 5, but they also have to have some really like baseline factors of independence, like obviously being potty trained, and just things like that, just so that once they're at school, the focus can be more on social skills, emotional skills, and that foundational academic base. Of the 62 million school-age children, 49 million attend public school. I remember the first time that I was working on these PowerPoints and I wrote the statistic down and I was like, oh my gosh, how does almost 10 million students not attend school? The key word in there is public school. So 49 out of our 62 million children are attending public school. That other chunk is going to be in a different type of school. So let's go ahead and break down some of these different types of schools. Starting with a charter school. Charter schools are funded by the government. They do not cost anything to go to these schools. These are usually schools that have a specific academic focus, maybe a specific fine arts or STEM related focus. And essentially, it kind of promises a learning environment that's going to be centered around that specific academic course or content. I've also seen charter schools in the past that were specifically centered around like a positive attribute, like friendship or loyalty. These are more of like a very creative public school because they can take the things that they specifically really care about, and then obviously, like if you're going to enroll your child in there, you would want to care about them as well. But you should not pay for a charter school. A charter school should be free because it's still funded by the government, but they do not follow any of the state educational standards. A magnet school. I worked at a magnet school when I was in Chicago. It's the name itself is a great it's a great understanding for what it really is. So it's a school that might be centrally located, and they bus students in from all different neighborhoods to come to this school. Not only does that promote diversity, not only does that promote equity, but it allows more funding for the school because they're pulling from different neighborhoods. A lot of the times, if a magnet school is really highly rated, there's like a lottery system in which kids can get picked to be attendants at that school. And legally, they should also have to get bused there as well. Now, there is a negative there. If you have a really great magnet school, and so, for example, like the magnet school I worked at downtown Chicago, it was an awesome school. I had multiple students that were on the bus for over 2 hours each day, busing to the school. Yes, great opportunities. You know that they're going to get a really high level of education, but that's a lot on a kid to be in a bus in a big city like that by themselves for that much time each and every day. A residential school, this is also just referred to as a neighborhood school. So this is essentially like your very typical public school that's like surrounded by neighborhood. So typically, like especially in Ohio, this is what you are most familiar with. A virtual school takes place online. A lot of residential schools have actually partnered with virtual schools specifically since COVID. And then again, as students hit high school, a lot of students are opting to continue and finish their high school education through a virtual school or do a half and half situation. Private schools. So private schools can become accredited. And once they're accredited, essentially means that they have a certain level of rigor that they're holding the students to, and that they are connected somewhat with whatever those state standards are, whatever the Common Core is. Private schools can be extremely expensive. They can also be centered around religion. And private schools essentially can do whatever they want. They do not have a government regulation system. They truly can make individual choices for their school. And if you find a great private school, that can look really great for your student, providing them a lot of really specialty resources. But then you can also find some difficult private schools. Private schools tend to pay teachers significantly less, but sometimes there's better benefits. So it's just a really unique system. Just a personal story. Like I was never a huge fan of private schools throughout my educational career, but learning more about specifically like the state of education in Michigan, where I'm now located, and my husband being at a private school for the first time after we both came from Title I schools. And a Title I school is essentially like the lowest socioeconomic school that you can be at, where students are significantly struggling economically. And so to then see that transition to a private school here in Michigan, where students have so many resources, where the amount of people from my husband's private school that get into the University of Michigan, one of the hardest colleges to get into, was over 60% of the graduating class. And so it's really interesting, especially like if you have children, or in the future, if you're working with a child and they go to a private school, definitely something to look into about the values. And then again, just understanding that expectation that's then placed upon the child, because it's no longer just sending your school it's no longer just sending your child to school to learn, but it's also sort of putting a financial investment in your child and their schooling. And so there can be a lot more pressure with that. And then finally, a school voucher. So this has to do with the fact that every child that attends a school, the government pays for. And so parents can opt out of the neighborhood school and apply for certain private schools or different schools in their community, in which that they would then, that new school that the child is enrolling in, as long as the enrollment numbers will allow that, then they would receive the financial reimbursement of that child. Okay, so in the classroom, there's some different levels of support, and I wanted to go ahead and read through this. So when we are working with a child that maybe struggles behaviorally, maybe struggles socially, we're going to give them some different assessments. We're going to take a lot of different notes, and then we're going to figure out which level, which tier of support they need to best feel safe in the classroom. So tier 1 is just being sensitive to the fact that a child has probably experienced trauma. This is just building school-wide strategies for addressing trauma and building resiliency. This is this whole idea of those social emotional learning lessons, typically always starting off your day with a comforting space, talking about how can we handle and regulate our emotions. This is universal for everyone. All students can benefit this. Even if a student hasn't experienced trauma, these types of strategies and lessons are preventative and proactive and can help anyone. Now, if we continue to see that left gray arrow spike up, which is the intensity of need and then the response, these are students where they're going to need maybe a small group. they're going to need maybe some social groups to talk through some things that maybe they struggle with. Maybe that's once a week with a counselor or a social worker, and that's going to be considered a secondary intervention. So these might be students that have already been exposed, or maybe they're at risk of being exposed to a certain trauma. And this is typically done in a small group. Now, again, as that arrow continues rising, if they're still really struggling, that's when we go into that individualized intervention. That can look like time with a counselor, time with a social worker, independent time with a teacher, and again, that's one-on-one. And so this is all case by case with each student. Typically every school I've worked at, once a semester, if there's a student that becomes on our radar for any issue, whether that's behavior, social, emotional, academic, we fill out sort of an intervention slip for them. And we have something very similar to this with academic interventions, but this is specific for behavior, trauma sensitivity, understanding what they're going to need in school. Excuse me. Excuse me. So again, everyone, like every teacher and every person that works at a school should always be doing that bottom level. Social workers in educational settings. Excuse me. School social workers must have a master's level in a mental health profession, and they need to have targeted expertise in serving children. Sorry. So let me start this page over. School social workers must have sorry, a master's level degree in mental health, and they have to have targeted expertise. All right, maybe I'll just skip that point. Essentially, a school social worker's job is to really understand the community, understand the children that they're working with, the families, and being able to step in when they see that that child or that family is having a difficult time. Excuse me. I'm gonna step away and blow my nose. I'll be right back. Take a second and read through these bullet points, and then I'll go over that. I'm sorry about that. Hey, as we were saying, so school social workers, honestly, if you are in a school ever that has a designated social worker just for your school building, you're really lucky because that's not a legally mandatory thing. Most districts have one social worker for the entire district. These are people who have significant expertise in understanding the community, understanding resources that are available to children and families who are struggling, and then can also take on that counseling perspective as well. They serve as a liaison between the community-based service providers and the children and families in the schools who need them. So essentially, they are like the people that say, oh my gosh, this is what's happening. I'm going to connect you with this person to help you. Most of the time, the social worker is more of the middleman who's going to essentially show them to the resources. They can't necessarily provide all the resources. Really, really important in developing and implementing training programs and school-wide changes to create safe and supportive environments. This is not the same as a school psychologist. Again, my district has one school psychologist for the entire district, and each building has a social worker. So every place can do it differently. A school psychologist is the person who can actually diagnose students, who can complete tests, and then can create plans that the social worker can support. And the social worker can check in with students who have 504s, students who are struggling in the classroom, and just students who need general counseling. So social workers can often also work really closely with the school counselor as well. So Educational rights of a traumatized child, the reactive attachment disorder and different adjustment disorders, hyperarousal, hypervigilance. These are all things that a student might just actively be going through in the classroom if they've experienced trauma. And it's our job as educators to understand that maybe how a child is reacting, maybe how a child is perceiving a situation is not necessarily their fault. It's probably just how their brain has been rewired after that traumatic event. Um, there's some different things. So specifically Section 504, this is an anti-discrimination protection for students with disabilities. This requires all people to have equal access to educational opportunities. So essentially in education, if you are diagnosed with a specific disorder, you are given what's called an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. If you don't necessarily fit a diagnosis, but you still need additional support. So a lot of times this can be a student that has anxiety. This can be a student that has obsessive compulsive disorder. And yes, that is a diagnosis, but it's not necessarily a learning specific diagnosis. Then they would get what's called 504. Now, for example, like if a student has anxiety and they are given 504, it's just going to give them some additional accommodations to be successful in the classroom, such as if they had a panic attack during a test, that they would be given an additional time to remake the test, and maybe future testing would only occur in a small group situation. It essentially looks at each child with that IEP and gives them an individualized education plan. So what are they going to need to be successful? Schools cannot disqualify students for coverage under 504 due to other mitigating factors like medication or other interventions. So what this means is just because your child has ADHD and they're on medication, it doesn't take them off of a 504. Or if your child has a 504 because they have diagnosed anxiety, but just because they go see a therapist, it doesn't mean that they're going to be off of the 504 accommodations. Essentially, like medication and interventions and counseling, like those are great things that can definitely positively support a child in the classroom. And so in no means do we want to take away the additional accommodations that were created to support them. So on my next slide, we're going to talk about least restrictive environment. This is something that educators have to consistently and constantly be thinking about when we're looking at a child and what they need. Sometimes I've been around teachers that have had a really, really difficult student, maybe a really traumatized student that maybe has a lot of behavior issues. This can get scary when they're throwing things, threatening to hurt people. The more severe, especially a physical threat is, the more difficult it can be to have the child in the classroom. Now, a lot of times the teacher's response is that they need to go to in-school suspension, or they need to be out of school expulsion, or get this kid out of my classroom. But the more that we push these students out of the classroom, the more restrictive that we're creating their educational experience. If a student is struggling with communication and that leads to verbal outbursts, putting them in a small box where they're going to sit there for the next 30 days in DAP, or being expelled where they're not talking to anyone at home for a few days, like that's not going to benefit our end cause. And again, like I've been on both sides of this as an educator, where I've had an extremely difficult student who was hurting another child. And my heart breaks because, oh my gosh, they're hurting another child. I can't have them in here. But then when you stop and you think about like, how is this going to positively affect the child that has experienced trauma and is now taking that out on someone else? And so least restrictive environment is, how can we keep the child in the classroom as much as possible so that they can get as much learning and educational experience, whether that's social, emotional, or specifically academic, and thinking through what that looks like. Now, that does not mean that a child's going to hurt someone and they're going to stay in the classroom all day, every day. Obviously, there are behavior punishments and things like that, but just thinking through this specifically when we're looking at students with IEPs and 504s. RTI stands for response to intervention. So just determining if there's going to be specifically special education eligibility, transition planning for students who will soon graduate. I've sat in many meetings at a high school level with students that were about to graduate, with career counselors, with counselors that were going to provide them additional services, and community college counselors, things like that. We're just trying to help these kids find the best way to break the cycle of trauma. Again, a 504 provides accommodations within the educational setting due to a disability, while an IEP provides modifications to curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So both a 504 and an IEP provides accommodations. The biggest difference between a 504 and an IEP, specifically an IEP, is when you are referred into the special education department. And that's because you have something going on that's affecting your academic ability. And that is like your actual ability to learn, versus a 504 might be like a personality disorder or a difficult situation. And an IEP is going to be something like autism spectrum disorder or Down syndrome, or if you're emotionally impaired. These almost, I don't want to say more, but almost sometimes more difficult to processing things. And you only really modify curriculum if it's someone who's significantly academically impaired. Otherwise, if you are modifying curriculum at too high of a level, then you could potentially delay their graduation. And so it's very specific with the school and what that school's expectation looks like. Just wanted to show you here what this looks like specifically in Michigan. I thought this was another really interesting diagram. This is about LRE, so that least restrictive environment. So the bottom is a fully mainstreamed regular classroom instruction, regular classroom construction with a consultation. So this is where a student is taught by a regular teacher, but might be advised by a special educator. Continuing up. So as you go up, the more restrictive it is, and the less amount of people are in the room. Regular classroom with supplementary instruction and services. So a student is taught by both a classroom teacher and a special educator in a regular classroom. Then we have our purple, which is our resource program. Student is in a regular classroom for most of the school day, but spends some time in a resource room for specialized instruction. Typically, that purple level is going to be where the vast majority of kids with learning disabilities sit. If you have a behavior disability, so something that might be more related to like attention deficit disorder, or if you're just struggling emotionally, something like that, it might be that green box or that red box where you're getting pulled for a counseling service or something like that, or maybe you have a paraprofessional. After you continue past the purple, you get to a separate classroom. So this is a regular school, but is taught by a special education teacher in a special separate classroom. Separate school is it's a school that's specifically for students with disabilities. Residential school is where the child lives there for 24 hours a day and is taught by a trained staff. And then finally, homebound or hospital. So this is someone that just can't even make it to school. So they are in completely restricted environment and they're the only one. So you can see that the further you go up, the more difficult it is to promote positive socialization with other students, with other administrators and teachers. And we really want to keep our students as low on this box as possible, because the more that we can keep them in the class, the higher likelihood that they're going to be able to pick up the material. Now, of course, we want to provide the supports that they need to be successful, whether they've gone through a traumatic event or not. But the more time that they can spend fully mainstreamed into a regular classroom, it's just going to promote a significantly higher likelihood of being able to form relationships with their peers and positive relationships with their teachers as well. So, all right, I just wanted to kind of cap this off. I'm sure you can tell that this is like where my heart is. This is where what I know the most about, and what I feel the most passionate about is just school and being able to help children through school. And I mean, firmly, like, I believe school should be the happy place for kids. And if they're experiencing trauma elsewhere, that school should be the place where they feel safe enough to talk about it and learn and grow. And so I kind of just want to leave you with some questions today. So thinking about if you are experiencing time where you get to work with a child, like, What would you do to create quality learning environments for these children? What are some unique needs that certain groups and students have? And then just thinking about your own experience. Now, again, like you're not typing this anywhere. This is really just for you. But just to think about your own experience in school. What types of schools did you attend? What were some of the positive and negative experiences you had? And what types of services did the school offer? And then maybe do you see any room for improvement? So maybe one of these will pop up for our weekly lecture quiz. So that is it for this week. I hope that you feel like you could take something from today's lesson. Again, I'm just so passionate about educational settings. Please let me know if you need anything this week. Shoot me an email, message me on Canvas. I'm happy to message you back. I've had a lot of people reach out to me and talk to me about how they're able to make some personal connections with this course's content so far. And not only is that going to benefit your understanding of it, but it's going to allow you to further relate this to other people when you're assisting them. So let me know if you need anything. Thank you guys so much for working so hard. And again, your Bruce Perry paper will be due at the end of next week. So have a great week.